Imagine Earth as a silent, steaming rock, wrapped in a blanket of volcanic breath, where lightning played tag with the oceans, and sunlight was more of a visitor than a regular guest. No trees, no fish, no sky blue enough to paint. Just a world simmering in darkness, quietly planning life's grand entrance. 4.5 billion years ago, Earth was the ultimate work in progress, a newborn planet still wearing its construction helmet. If you could somehow stand on its surface back then, which you couldn't without melting, you'd see a landscape that looked less like a home and more like a cosmic crime scene. Volcanoes weren't gentle mountains. They were furious pressure cookers spewing rivers of molten rock. The ground shuddered constantly. Continents didn't exist, and the oceans, if you can call them that, were more like boiling chemical cauldrons. Good evening, curious minds. I truly hope you will enjoy today's video. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where and when you're tuning in. And if you find yourself learning something new as you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing, only if you enjoy these calm journeys through the universe. Now, let's begin. The air wasn't breathable unless you were into inhaling a spicy mix of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur, and ammonia. It would sting your lungs before you even got the chance to complain. The sky above wasn't blue, but stained in murky reds and oranges, dimmed by choking clouds of volcanic ash. Sunlight, when it broke through, didn't warm the planet much. Instead, it flickered across a surface still cooling from cosmic impact after cosmic impact. Earth's early years were basically a meteorite convention. At this time, the moon was much closer, looming large in the sky like an overprotective sibling. Its gravitational pull caused massive tides that sloshed across Earth's hot, chaotic oceans. Each tidal movement helped mix the planet's early chemistry, stirring potential ingredients of life in a way no laboratory could replicate. Think of it as the universe's first blender, powered by lunar gravity. But here's the wild part. Despite the chaos, Earth was already showing off its potential. Beneath the destruction was balance quietly forming. The molten crust began to cool and harden, creating the first hints of solid ground. Water vapor condensed into rain, falling in endless storms that lasted millions of years. The sound of those rains, if you could hear through the thunder and fire, would be like the heartbeat of a planet settling into itself. Those rains pooled into basins and valleys, forming the first oceans, dark, hot, and filled with dissolved minerals leaching from the young crust. If you could dip your hand into it, it wouldn't be refreshing. It'd be like plunging into a witch's cauldron of metals, salts, and mystery ingredients. Yet this murky brew was exactly what life would one day need. A planetary soup simmering with promise. Lightning struck constantly. Not the occasional dramatic bolt we see today, but relentless electrical storms cracking across the atmosphere, splitting molecules apart and forcing them into new combinations. Each flash was like the planet experimenting, testing out chemistry recipes. If Earth had a motto at this stage, it would have been trial, error, and lots of explosions. And then there was the darkness, the kind that wasn't just the absence of light, but a blanket of time itself. For billions of years, the planet lived in this dim twilight, with only the faintest glow from magma and starlight. No eyes existed to see it, but if they had, the view would have been hauntingly beautiful. Steam rising from molten rivers, volcanic plumes painting the sky, and oceans reflecting the faint red shimmer of a sun filtered through chaos. There was no oxygen yet, no ozone layer to shield the surface. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun blasted down with unfiltered intensity, sterilizing everything it touched. But the oceans, those murky, simmering oceans, provided refuge. Beneath the waves, light dimmed and radiation weakened. Down there, chemistry was free to get weird, free to take chances without being fried by sunlight. Earth's early surface was, in a sense, the universe's laboratory. It was a stage where the physical laws of chemistry, pressure, and heat rehearsed for something miraculous. Hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, the big four of biochemistry, were all there, floating, colliding, reacting. The building blocks of life were present, but they hadn't yet learned to cooperate. Imagine a band with all the instruments ready, but no one's figured out how to play in sync. The symphony was coming, though, and the first notes were already tuning in the dark. It's humbling to think that every living thing, every person, tree, whale, and bacterium traces its lineage back to this boiling, toxic world. Life didn't start in a paradise. It started in a storm, in a planet that seemed determined to make existence impossible. And maybe that's the point. Earth didn't need to be gentle to make life, it just needed to be unpredictable. If we could describe that ancient world in a single sentence, it would be this. The planet was chaos pretending to be calm. It was a raw, dangerous beauty, one that didn't yet know what it was capable of. The stage was set, the chemistry was brewing, and in the shadows of volcanic light, something extraordinary was about to happen. Life wasn't here yet, but the invitation had already been sent, and the first guests were on their way, hidden in the dark. Beneath pitch-black waters, chemical soups bubbled like the universe's first kitchen experiment. It was less Finding Nemo and more Finding Molecule, with hydrothermal vents acting as cosmic coffee machines brewing the ingredients of life. If you were to dive into Earth's oceans during those early, sunless eons, you wouldn't find coral reefs or fish darting through beams of light. You'd find absolute darkness. The water was thick, mineral-rich, and eerily quiet, except for the deep rumble of volcanic activity below. The oceans weren't the blue cradles of life we know today. They were heavy, dark stews of chemicals, simmering with energy and mystery. The pressure alone would have crushed modern submarines like soda cans, and the temperature changed from near freezing in the upper layers to boiling at the seafloor. But hidden in that darkness, at the boundaries where magma met seawater, something miraculous was brewing. Along cracks in the ocean floor, hydrothermal vents belched superheated water rich in metals and minerals. They weren't just underwater chimneys. They were the planet's chemical laboratories. Imagine enormous black towers spewing plumes of scalding, mineral-laden water that shimmered like smoke in the abyss. Around them, the water cooled rapidly, forming jagged mineral walls, strange underwater castles where chemistry and heat conspired. These vents weren't powered by sunlight because sunlight didn't reach this deep. They ran on pure geothermal energy, the inner fire of the planet itself. The water around them was a chaotic mixture of molecules: hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, iron, and countless trace elements. This toxic cocktail might not sound appetizing, but it was exactly the kind of messy, unpredictable chemistry that life seems to love. The beauty of these vents was not just their heat, but their structure. Their mineral walls created tiny pockets and chambers, little chemical apartments where molecules could gather and interact. Inside these microspaces, temperature gradients and mineral surfaces acted like natural test tubes, concentrating the ingredients of life and encouraging them to react. It was the universe's version of slow cooking, patient, persistent, and filled with flavor. Picture it. Deep beneath a world without sunlight, the only glow came from faint geothermal light. The water shimmered faintly with mineral dust, like a galaxy in liquid form. Hydrogen and carbon dioxide met across mineral barriers, forming simple organic molecules. Some of these stuck together, becoming more complex. It was chemistry's first attempt at organization, random at first, but slowly learning the rhythm of repetition. And repetition is what nature does best. The conditions near these vents were brutally unstable. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, scalding one moment, chilling the next. But that instability was part of the magic. In a stable environment, nothing changes. In chaos, however, new things emerge. Molecules that could endure the heat and reform after breaking apart were favored. Over time, these survivors became the foundation for something new. The first self-sustaining reactions, the faint heartbeat of life's beginning. Imagine a microscopic scene. Molecules clustering on a mineral surface, reacting, separating, joining again. Tiny cycles of creation and destruction happening endlessly, powered by the energy gradients around them. Some reactions produced amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. Others made lipids, the ingredients for primitive membranes. Slowly, a few lucky combinations found ways to store energy, the biochemical equivalent of discovering fire. These weren't alive yet, but they were definitely rehearsing for the role. The deep ocean was a paradoxical place, hostile and nurturing at once. On one hand, it was scalding, pressurized, and devoid of light. On the other, it was stable enough to shelter these fragile chemical experiments from the chaos above. Meteors might have been crashing onto continents, volcanoes exploding, but down here, everything was timeless. The deep sea didn't care what the surface was doing. It was a world of its own, quiet, steady, and endlessly creative. If early Earth's oceans were a cosmic kitchen, hydrothermal vents were the chefs that never slept. They kept stirring the planetary soup, feeding it energy and minerals. The water flowing through these vents acted like conveyor belts, constantly cycling materials. It's as if the planet itself was conducting chemistry lessons, with lava as the instructor and water as the eager student. Over time, these chemical experiments gave rise to complex molecules that could make crude copies of themselves. Copying, that's where things got interesting. Once a molecule can make a version of itself, even imperfectly, evolution has something to work with. Mistakes in copying lead to variation, and variation leads to innovation. Out of the endless oceanic dark, chemistry began to flirt with biology. But let us not romanticize it too much. This wasn't a neat process. There were no rules, no grand design. Life didn't burst into being like a magic trick. It stumbled, failed, and tried again for millions of years. It was like the world's longest science experiment conducted by a planet that didn't even know it was experimenting. If you could have peered into those dark waters, you might have seen shimmering clouds of minerals, rising like ghostly smoke. No fish, no plants. Just the faint chemical glow of possibility. Yet within that glow lay everything that would ever swim, walk, or dream. The deep ocean didn't need sunlight to begin the story of life. It had something better. Persistence. It had energy, chemistry, and endless time. Every bubble that rose from a vent carried potential. Every mineral wall that formed might have been the cradle of the first living system. Billions of years later, hydrothermal vents still exist on our seafloors, and they still host life. Creatures that don't need sunlight, only chemistry. In a way, they're the last whispers of that original world, still brewing the same cosmic coffee that once sparked the miracle of life. So when you think about the origins of existence, don't picture a sunny paradise. Picture an alien darkness, an ocean olive with invisible potential. Life began not in the light, but in the shadowy warmth of the deep. Proof that sometimes the most extraordinary things grow where no one can see them. Simple molecules began to dance, collide, and accidentally invent biochemistry. It was the awkward first date of carbon and hydrogen, where energy from lightning or vent heat turned chaos into the first whispers of order, life's soft-spoken rehearsal. If the early Earth was a chaotic concert of heat and storms, this was the moment the instruments began to find rhythm. For millions of years, simple molecules had been floating, colliding, and breaking apart in the planet's oceans and atmosphere, random chemical chaos with no direction. But somewhere in that wild mix, patterns started to emerge. The chemistry wasn't just reacting anymore, it was rehearsing something new. The universe had found its first dance floor, and carbon was the life of the party. Carbon, by the way, is a bit of an overachiever. Out of all the elements in the periodic table, it's the one that can form the most bonds, link into endless chains, and basically build anything. It's the Lego brick of the universe. Pair it with hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and suddenly you've got the ingredients for amino acids, sugars, and fats, the foundations of biology. These molecules didn't appear all at once like guests arriving fashionably late to a party. They built up slowly, as lightning, ultraviolet light, and volcanic heat kept zapping the atmosphere and stirring the oceans. Each burst of energy acted like a cosmic DJ spinning the molecules into new arrangements. Lightning would rip through the air, splitting gases apart and forcing them back together in unexpected ways. Every storm was like a million chemistry experiments happening at once. Some of those reactions created complex organic molecules, the kind of stuff that would later form proteins and DNA. But at this point, there were no cells, no life, just a planetary rave of atoms trying new combinations, failing and trying again. Imagine a droplet of early ocean water under a microscope. You'd see a swirling soup of organic molecules, amino acids, simple sugars, fatty acids, all bumping into one another, forming temporary bonds, breaking apart and reforming again. It was chaos, but it wasn't meaningless chaos. Some molecules were beginning to form repeating structures. Some found that by sticking together, they could last a little longer before dissolving. In chemistry, longevity is everything. The longer something sticks around, the more it can interact, and the more chances it has to do something new. Here's where the story gets fun. Some of those fatty molecules had an interesting property. When placed in water, they naturally arranged themselves into little bubbles, like microscopic soap bubbles. This happened because one end of the molecule liked water and the other hated it. So, they self-organized, not out of intelligence but out of simple physics. These bubbles created tiny pockets, trapping other molecules inside. Suddenly, reactions that used to drift apart could happen in a confined space, protected from the outside world. In a way, these were life's first VIP sections, chemistry's attempt at privacy. Inside these microscopic bubbles, molecules began reacting in new ways. The conditions inside might be slightly different from those outside. A little more acidic, a little more concentrated. Over time, some of these bubble-enclosed reactions became self-sustaining. A molecule might form, break down, and, in the process, produce another molecule that helped make more of itself. That's not life yet, but it's close. It's the first whisper of metabolism, chemistry, that feeds back into itself. Meanwhile, other types of molecules were learning a different trick, storing information. Some simple chains of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen began arranging themselves into sequences that could act as templates, meaning they could help new chains form in the same pattern. This was the dawn of molecular memory. It wasn't DNA yet, but it was the idea of it, the first hint that chemistry could remember what worked and repeat it. And once you have memory and metabolism, you have the foundation for evolution. The stage was set for natural selection to enter the chemical world. Molecules that were more stable, that could replicate faster or survive heat longer, became more common. Those that couldn't handle the pressure, literally, broke apart and vanished. No consciousness, no plan, just survival written in chemical persistence. The fascinating part is how unintentional it all was. None of this was directed or designed. Carbon didn't wake up one day and decide to make life. It just followed the rules of physics and chemistry. The conditions of early Earth nudged molecules toward complexity because complexity, in this environment, was stable. In the great soup of randomness, order was a natural side effect. Think of it like this. When snowflakes form, they create intricate, symmetrical patterns. Not because they plan to, but because water molecules follow simple physical rules that lead to beauty. Life's chemistry did the same thing, except instead of snowflakes, it made molecules that could copy themselves and grow. Beauty through physics, evolution's favorite trick. As the oceans churned, these microscopic reactions multiplied. Some molecules formed rings and chains, others folded into delicate shapes. The first catalysts, molecules that could speed up reactions, appeared, making everything happen faster. Chemistry had gone from stumbling around in the dark to choreographing a full routine. It was as if the universe had accidentally invented teamwork. What's mind-bending is how much of this still happens inside us today. Every cell in your body is a descendant of that original chemistry party. Molecules dancing, reacting, passing information, and turning energy into order. The same carbon atoms that once whirled in volcanic seas are now part of your DNA, helping you think about where they came from. So, yes, life began with chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. Molecules collided, sparked, and somehow learned to cooperate. The universe didn't need a blueprint, it just needed a few good dance partners and a lot of time. Out of random motion came rhythm, and out of rhythm came replication. Chemistry didn't know it yet, but the party it had started in those dark oceans would never end. Once the chemical chaos calmed and the molecular dance began finding rhythm, something truly extraordinary happened. Chemistry crossed the invisible line into biology. The world's first cells appeared. Tiny packets of survival sealed inside thin membranes. They weren't much to look at. No brains, no limbs, no drama, just microscopic bubbles of organized molecules. But make no mistake, these were the pioneers, the microscopic architects of everything to come. They had no eyes to see, no nervous systems to sense, yet they adapted to a planet that was still wildly unpredictable. Volcanic eruptions shook the ocean floors. Gases hissed from vents, turning the water into a toxic mineral soup. Temperatures swung from scalding to freezing in the blink of a geological eye. And in the middle of all that, these first cells, the ancestors of archaea and bacteria, found ways to thrive. If life were a sport, these early microbes were the ultimate endurance athletes. Let's start with the archaea. They were the rugged survivalists of the early world, thriving where almost nothing else could. Many lived in boiling hot springs, others in highly acidic environments, and some deep in the seafloor where the pressure was crushing. Archaea didn't just survive in extremes, they made those extremes their home. Their cell walls were built differently from anything else, more flexible and resilient, designed for conditions that would have dissolved modern life instantly. They were like microscopic tank builders, small but indestructible. Meanwhile, bacteria took a different approach. They diversified. They didn't just conquer one environment, they colonized everything they could find. If archaea were the daredevils jumping into volcanoes, bacteria were the urban planners spreading across the landscape, setting up microscopic colonies wherever energy was available. Together, they divided the planet between them. Archaea took the harshest corners, and bacteria filled in everything else. What made them so successful was their simplicity. Each was essentially a tiny chemical factory, endlessly turning raw materials into energy. They didn't eat in the way animals do. Instead, they absorbed chemicals from their surroundings and used ingenious internal reactions to convert them into life-sustaining energy. Some ate hydrogen, others preferred methane or sulfur compounds. To modern life, these substances are poison. To early microbes, they were breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In those early oceans, gases bubbled up constantly from the seafloor. Hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, ammonia. The first microbial communities formed around the cracks and vents that released these gases. There, the microbes created the tiny ecosystems, invisible cities powered by chemistry. They stuck to rocks, multiplied, and formed mats that coated underwater surfaces. From above, If you could have seen it, the seafloor would have looked like it had grown a carpet made of living film. These microbial mats were the planet's first engineering projects. They stabilized sediments, altered chemical flows, and even changed the chemistry of the oceans around them. In a sense, the microbes were already reshaping their environment. The same way trees would one day change the air and coral reefs would sculpt coastlines. Evolution's first architects were too small to see, yet they were already building worlds. And the teamwork, oh, the teamwork. Microbes quickly figured out the art of collaboration. When one type of cell released waste, another used that waste as fuel. They built complex food chains without even knowing it. One species might oxidize sulfur, producing compounds that another species used to reduce iron, which in turn supported yet another species living nearby. This constant exchange turned patches of seafloor into bustling microbial markets. But perhaps their greatest invention wasn't survival or cooperation. It was communication. Microbes began to send chemical signals to one another, tiny molecular messages that said things like, "Hey, there's more hydrogen over here," or "Time to slow down reproduction." These weren't words, of course, but chemical cues that let entire colonies coordinate behavior. It was the earliest version of social networking. Call it microbe book. Over time, these colonies grew massive. Some became layered structures known as stromatolites, biological skyscrapers built from sediment and microbial film. Each layer was a record of life continuing, generation after generation, for thousands of years. Even today, in a few remote places like Shark Bay in Australia, stromatolites still exist, quietly bubbling away in the shallow water, living fossils of a world billions of years gone. Now, what's truly astonishing is how these microbes didn't just adapt to their environment, they transformed it. Through their metabolic processes, they began changing the balance of gases in the atmosphere and motions. Some produced methane, others produced carbon compounds that altered the chemistry of the seas. Slowly, the planet's chemistry started to stabilize. In a sense, life was beginning to terraform its own home. The planet that had once been ruled by blind physics was now being gently steered by biology. And all this happened without a hint of consciousness or planning. These organisms weren't inventors. They were natural consequences of survival. But their survival had side effects that rippled across the planet. For example, when microbes consumed sulfur or iron, they left behind minerals that formed new layers in the seabed. Geologists can still find these layers today, literal time capsules of Earth's microbial adolescence. Each microbe was small enough to fit thousands on the head of a pin, yet together they changed the entire face of the planet. Over billions of years, they refined their metabolisms, split into new species, and filled every crack, crevice, and bubble of Earth's crust. Even now, beneath our feet, trillions of their descendants live miles underground, quietly maintaining the planet's chemistry while the surface world basks in light and oxygen. The rise of these microbial architects marked a turning point in Earth's story. Life had proven it could persist in the darkest, most hostile environments imaginable. And it had begun to build, not structures of stone or wood, but networks of chemistry, feedback, and resilience. The blueprints of survival were drawn not with ink or plans, but with molecules and membranes. If evolution had a motto back then, it might have been something like this: think small, build big, never stop adapting. The microbial world did just that, turning the hostile Earth into a living planet one molecule at a time. They were the unseen engineers of existence, humble, tireless, and utterly unstoppable. Everything that would come after, forests, dinosaurs, humans, would owe their existence to these tiny builders who made life possible in a world that should have been uninhabitable. Long before sunlight became the planet's go-to energy source, Earth's early residents lived in complete darkness. For these microscopic pioneers, the word photosynthesis hadn't even been invented, mostly because there was no one around to invent anything. Instead, these early microbes mastered a completely different survival strategy. They learned how to eat the planet itself. Deep beneath the ocean surface, far away from any hint of light, the only thing glowing was magma. Volcanic vents spewed out gases that would be lethal to anything alive today. Hydrogen sulfide, methane, and iron compounds that turned the water around them into a chemical soup of danger. Yet, to these microbes, it was a feast. They evolved metabolisms that could take these poisons and turn them into energy. It was like learning how to dine on lightning and lava. Not exactly the kind of meal you'd find on a menu, but for them, it was the survival deluxe. This process is called chemosynthesis, a word that sounds technical but is really just making food from chemistry. Unlike photosynthesis, which uses sunlight to power life, chemosynthesis runs on chemical reactions. It's the biological version of hacking the system. Instead of waiting for daylight, these microbes used the energy stored in Earth's internal chemistry to power their tiny cellular engines. Imagine one of these microbes clinging to a rocky vent deep under the sea. Around it, superheated water gushes out, filled with hydrogen sulfide. The microbe absorbs the gas and reacts it with carbon dioxide dissolved in the water. The result? Energy. Pure, usable energy that it can store and use to build more of itself. It's like charging your phone with volcano power. This trick allowed life to exist in total darkness, powered only by the planet's heartbeat. But these microbes weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Whole communities formed around the vent systems. One microbe's waste became another's fuel, forming miniature ecosystems that pulsed with chemical energy. Some oxidized sulfur, releasing energy in the process. Others used iron, converting it from one chemical form to another to squeeze out every bit of power. Methane-eating microbes even began turning greenhouse gases into biomass, helping stabilize the planet's atmosphere long before climate change was a problem anyone could name. These chemical reactions were astonishingly efficient. Each one was like a microscopic factory line. Raw materials in, energy out. Some microbes developed layered structures on rocks, where each layer specialized in a different step of the chemical process. They were, in essence, building the first energy grids, balancing input and output in ways that modern ecosystems still echo. The entire seafloor became a dark, glowing city of microbes, quietly humming with invisible industry. What's particularly fascinating is how these microbes turned limitation into advantage. Light, after all, is unreliable. Day turns to night. Clouds block the sun, and surface environments can change. But the Earth's chemical energy, that was constant. As long as the core stayed hot and vents kept breathing, there was an endless supply of fuel. These microbes had tapped into something eternal, a power source that didn't care about weather, seasons, or the rising and setting of the sun. Even in places where vents weren't active, microbes found ways to survive on leftover chemistry. Some burrowed into rocks to extract energy from iron minerals. Others learned to live inside sediments, feeding on slow chemical gradients created by reactions between seawater and stone. Life had officially gone underground, not hiding, but conquering. The beauty of this world was its adaptability. Every chemical gradient, every tiny difference in energy between two compounds, became an opportunity. Where one microbe used sulfur, another preferred methane. Where one oxidized iron, another reduced it. It was the biochemical equivalent of a world economy, with energy as the currency and chemistry as the marketplace. Competition and cooperation existed side by side, and somehow balance emerged. And let's not forget methane, that volatile gas so central to this story. Some microbes became masters of methane metabolism, producing it, consuming it, recycling it. They could take carbon dioxide and hydrogen, combine them, and spit out methane as waste. Others came along and devoured that methane, turning it back into carbon compounds. It was a perfect loop. One microbe's garbage was another's gourmet meal. Even today, descendants of these ancient chemical eaters still exist. Deep within the Earth's crust, miles below the surface, there are entire microbial worlds that have never seen sunlight. Some feed on hydrogen released from rocks. Others survive in oil reservoirs or inside tiny cracks filled with mineral-rich water. They are relics of that ancient time, proof that life doesn't need a sky to thrive. And then there's the smell. Modern sulfur-eating microbes, often found in hot springs or vents, release hydrogen sulfide, that infamous rotten egg scent. It's the smell of chemistry in action, a faint echo of Earth's earliest metabolism. Every time you get a whiff of it at a geothermal site, you're literally smelling the breath of ancient life. These lightless ecosystems also gave rise to one of the most beautiful examples of independence in nature: symbiosis. Some larger organisms, like tube worms and clams that appeared much later, would eventually evolve to host these chemosynthetic microbes inside their bodies. They didn't need mouths or stomachs. Their microbial tenants made food for them directly. It was the ultimate outsourcing deal. You handle the chemistry, I'll provide the housing. But before any of that complexity emerged, these single-celled chemists had already accomplished something profound. They had proven that life could exist and flourish without sunlight. They turned toxic gases into fuel, heat into growth, and darkness into possibility. They didn't just endure the absence of light, they made it irrelevant. It's easy to think of darkness as lifeless, as the opposite of vitality. But for these early microbes, darkness was the foundation of existence. They were living proof that where energy flows, life can follow, and as they multiplied, evolved, and spread through the oceans, they laid down the biochemical foundation for everything that would come next. The first ecosystems had been built, powered not by stars, but by the planet itself. In the end, these microbes didn't just live without light. They turned the darkness into a home, one filled with heat, chemistry and quiet determination. They were the universe's first energy engineers, dining on magma and gases while waiting for the day the world above would finally turn on the lights. If you could hop into a time machine and land on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, your first and last breath would be the same one. The air would hit your lungs like acid, your skin would burn, and your eyes, well, they'd probably regret being there at all. The sky above wasn't blue and calm. It was a thick orange-brown haze that turned the sunlight into something between a sunset and an apocalypse. You wouldn't find a single cloud as we know them, no white tufts or soft shapes. Instead, the atmosphere looked like a chemical soup suspended in the air, dense with methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. It was a world that smelled like rotten eggs, smog, and a chemistry lab all at once. But to the microbes living then, it was a 5-star resort. What was deadly to us was delicious to them. This wasn't a mistake in evolution. This was evolution's starting point. The very gases that would later become poisonous pollutants were, in those days, the foundation of life's metabolism. The air was a buffet of raw materials waiting to be converted into energy. The atmosphere's strange mix didn't happen by accident. Earth was still a restless planet, constantly exhaling gases from its molten insides. Every volcanic eruption, every crack in the crust released plumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds. The oceans simmered with dissolved gases that bubbled back into the air. There was no ozone layer to filter ultraviolet radiation. So sunlight split molecules apart with brutal efficiency, turning them into reactive fragments that recombined in weird and wonderful ways. In short, the entire planet was one giant chemistry experiment running 24 hours a day. Methane was one of the major players. Produced by early microbes and volcanoes alike, it acted like a thick insulating blanket around the planet. Without it, Earth might have frozen solid. The young sun wasn't as bright back then. Methane kept the heat in, turning the atmosphere into a greenhouse that allowed the oceans to stay liquid. Ironically, the same gas that now threatens modern climates was once the gas that kept life possible at all. Then there was ammonia, another strong-smelling character in this ancient drama. It gave the air its acrid sting, but also supplied nitrogen, a crucial ingredient for building proteins and DNA. Without ammonia, the chemistry of life would have stalled before it began. The catch was that ammonia couldn't last long when exposed to ultraviolet radiation. It broke down easily, but thanks to the haze of other gases, enough of it stuck around to feed the biosphere's growing appetite. The sky's strange color came from hydrocarbons, complex carbon-based molecules that formed when sunlight struck methane. These hydrocarbons clumped together into tiny particles, creating an orange haze that blanketed the planet. Think of it as a planetary sunscreen. It blocked some ultraviolet radiation, protecting surface life from sterilization, while also trapping heat below. Earth, quite unintentionally, had given itself a self-regulating smog. Ugly, perhaps, but effective. If you looked up through that haze, the sun would have appeared as a dull red orb. The light reaching the surface was weak and tinted, turning the oceans into dark, copper-colored expanses. The air shimmered with heat and chemical reactions. Lightning forked across the sky regularly, striking the volatile gases and sparking new molecules into existence. Each bolt was like the planet's ongoing laboratory test, forging amino acids and complex organics that rained into the sea. Every storm was a gift wrapped in plasma. For early microbes, this was heaven. They floated through the oceans or clung to mineral surfaces, breathing in gases that we'd consider toxic waste. Methanogens, for instance, took carbon dioxide and hydrogen and exhaled methane as waste, effectively farting out the very gas that kept their planet warm. Sulfur bacteria oxidized hydrogen sulfide, releasing energy in the process and leaving behind elemental sulfur. Each chemical reaction helped stabilize the atmospheric mix while feeding the biosphere. In essence, these microbes became the first planetary managers. Without intent or awareness, they began recycling gases, balancing chemical flows, and creating feedback loops that maintained habitable conditions. The atmosphere wasn't static, it was alive, shifting in response to microbial metabolism. When certain gases built up too high, new species evolved to consume them. When others dwindled, life found ways to make more. The planet and its inhabitants had entered a delicate dance of mutual influence. It's worth noting that this toxic air also shaped Earth's first weather. With so many greenhouse gases, the planet's heat distribution was uneven. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, causing intense storms and acidic rains that eroded rocks and carried minerals into the ocean. Those minerals, in turn, fed the microbes that produced more gases. The cycle went on endlessly. Air, rock, and life, locked in a constant exchange. To modernize, it would have looked like a hellscape. No blue skies, no birds, no green land, just a dense, orange world breathing clouds of methane and steam. But beneath that poisonous beauty, chemistry had learned to cooperate with biology. The microbes didn't just live in the atmosphere's shadow, they wrote the atmosphere's story. Slowly, their activity began to push the planet toward transformation. Methane levels fluctuated as microbes consumed and produced it in cycles. Carbon dioxide levels rose and fell with volcanic activity. The air wasn't yet ready for oxygen, but the stage was being set for something revolutionary. Life had already mastered the art of surviving on poison. Soon it would discover how to make its own air. But for now, this was the golden age of gas, an era where the smell of sulfur meant life, and the haze of hydrocarbons painted the sky in strange alien hues. To breathe this atmosphere was to die instantly. To be a microbe in it was to thrive magnificently. It's strange to think that the same gases that would later choke animals and blacken skies once served as the cradle of existence. But that's the paradox of evolution. Today's toxins were yesterday's treasures. What we call pollution, life once called progress. And through that thick haze, unseen and unbothered by the lack of oxygen, the tiny architects of the atmosphere went about their business, unknowingly preparing the planet for its next great revolution. The day air itself would change forever. Up until this point, life had been quietly minding its business in the dark, munching on chemicals, and getting along just fine without sunlight. Then, in one of evolution's most astonishing oops moments, a group of bacteria decided to try something completely different. they figured out how to eat sunlight. Not metaphorically, literally. This single evolutionary innovation would end up transforming the entire planet, though the bacteria responsible had no idea they were about to trigger the world's first global crisis. These bacteria were the ancestors of what we now call cyanobacteria, though back then no one was calling them anything at all. They were tiny, unassuming cells floating in the shallow oceans, probably just trying to survive another day in a world full of acid rain and volcanic burps. But they had stumbled upon the greatest energy source of all time, the sun. And, unlike the fickle chemistry of methane or sulfur, sunlight was free, constant, and abundant. It was the biological equivalent of finding an unlimited buffet. The trick they invented was photosynthesis, the process of using sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar. But their version came with a twist. Earlier, microbes had already figured out simpler forms of photosynthesis, ones that used chemicals like hydrogen sulfide instead of water. Those methods worked fine, but the new water-splitting technique had one big advantage. Water was everywhere. Oceans covered most of the planet, and tapping into that supply meant these bacteria would never run out of raw material. The catch? Splitting water releases oxygen as a byproduct. And on early Earth, oxygen was a disaster waiting to happen. It was a highly reactive gas in a world full of unoxidized minerals, unstable chemicals, and organisms that had evolved to live in its absence. But the cyanobacteria didn't care about that. They weren't environmentalists. They were hungry. For them, sunlight was lunch, and oxygen was just the burp that followed. At first, the oxygen they produced didn't make it far. It reacted immediately with iron in the oceans, forming rust. Massive quantities of dissolved iron turned into iron oxide and settled onto the seafloor. Layer after layer of this reddish sediment built up over millions of years, creating what we now know as banded iron formations, ancient geological time capsules marking the dawn of oxygen. The oceans literally rusted, turning from dark green to reddish brown. As the iron was used up, oxygen began to accumulate in the water itself, and eventually it escaped into the air. Slowly, invisibly, Earth's atmosphere began to change, and what had once been a methane-rich haze started to thin as oxygen reacted with it, breaking down the orange smog that had cloaked the planet for eons. For the first time, sunlight began to reach the surface clearly. The sky was turning blue, but at a cost. The very life forms that had once thrived under the methane blanket were now facing extinction. The Great Oxygenation Event, as scientists would later call it, was both a catastrophe and a miracle. For the oxygen-producing microbes, it was business as usual. For everything else, it was the apocalypse. Oxygen was toxic to most existing organisms. It corroded their cell structures and destroyed their delicate chemical balance. Entire ecosystems vanished. The once dominant anaerobes, those that lived without oxygen, were forced into the few places it couldn't reach, deep underground, in sediments, or around volcanic vents. In short, the world that had been their paradise became their prison. Meanwhile, the cyanobacteria thrived. They spread across the oceans, forming vast colonies known as stromatolites, living mats that built up layer upon layer like coral reefs made of microbes. These shimmering green films were Earth's first global gardeners, painting the surface of the seas with life that fed on light and exhaled air. From space, if anyone had been watching, Earth would have begun to shimmer differently, a planet learning to breathe. Oxygen didn't just change the air, it rewrote the planet's chemistry. It reacted with methane, reducing the greenhouse effect and cooling the planet dramatically. Some scientists think this triggered one of the earliest ice ages, the so-called snowball Earth events, where ice stretched from the poles toward the equator. The world may have frozen over as a direct result of photosynthesis, an ironic twist for life that had just mastered the art of using the sun. Imagine discovering fire and then accidentally freezing your house. Yet, as destructive as oxygen was, it also opened new doors. Once enough of it accumulated in the atmosphere, sunlight interacting with oxygen molecules began forming ozone, a thin layer of protection high above the planet. For the first time, the deadly ultraviolet radiation that had bombarded Earth's surface began to ease. With that shield in place, shallow waters became safer, and new forms of life could begin to evolve closer to the light. The planet had been sterilized by radiation for billions of years. Now it was finally becoming a place where complexity could bloom. Inside cells, oxygen became both a danger and an opportunity. It was reactive, yes. But that reactivity could also be harnessed. Some microbes evolved ways to use oxygen in their metabolism, extracting far more energy from food than ever before. This was the birth of aerobic respiration, an evolutionary superpower that would one day allow cells to grow larger, move faster, and eventually combine into multicellular organisms. Oxygen, once the great poison, was becoming the fuel of future life. It's almost poetic how accidental it all was. Those early cyanobacteria weren't planning to alter the climate or invent complex life. They were just trying to make sugar. But in doing so, they rewrote the planet's destiny. They cleared the skies, changed the oceans, and paved the way for every oxygen-breathing organism that would ever live. Every breath you take today, every inhale of sweet, invisible oxygen is a whisper from those ancient microbes. Their revolution turned a toxic world into a living one, painted the sky blue, and taught Earth how to sustain itself. So, yes, the cyanobacteria just wanted lunch. But in the process, they accidentally invented the concept of a habitable planet. The first breath of oxygen wasn't just a chemical reaction, it was the sound of the world waking up. The moment oxygen began to creep into the atmosphere, life on Earth found itself standing at an invisible crossroads. For some, this new gas was an evolutionary lottery ticket, a tool that would someday bar the rise of complex organisms. For others, it was the end of the world. The very thing we now depend on to stay alive was once the deadliest substance on the planet. It's one of evolution's cruelest ironies. The world's first apocalypse arrived not in fire or ice, but in fresh air. For billions of years, life had thrived in an oxygen-free paradise. The oceans were rich in dissolved metals and gases that fed anaerobic microbes, organisms that powered their metabolism through chemical reactions involving sulfur, iron, or methane. They lived comfortably in this reducing atmosphere, meaning one devoid of oxygen. To them, oxygen wasn't just useless, it was an existential threat. And then came the cyanobacteria, those unassuming architects of disaster. As they flooded the oceans with oxygen, the chemical balance that had sustained the anaerobic biosphere began to crumble. The poison spread slowly at first. As oxygen reacted with iron in the oceans and minerals on the seafloor. For a while, the planet's chemistry absorbed the excess, neutralizing it like a sponge soaking up water. But eventually, the sponge filled. The oxygen had nowhere else to go. It began to accumulate in the air. What followed was the biological equivalent of an extinction-level event. For countless anaerobic species, oxygen was pure corrosion. When it entered their cells, it reacted violently with their molecular machinery, damaging membranes, breaking apart enzymes, and scrambling DNA. Imagine a world where every breath burns you from the inside out. That was the new Earth for the anaerobes. Oxygen ripped through their biochemistry like acid, turning the once hospitable oceans into toxic baths. Whole ecosystems collapsed. Microbial colonies that had blanketed the ocean floor with their sulfur-based metabolisms vanished almost overnight on geological timescales. The planet's chemistry was rewriting itself faster than evolution could adapt. For many ancient species, there was no escape. Their metabolic systems, honed over eons for an oxygen-free world, simply couldn't handle the change. But life, as always, is stubborn. Not everything perished. The survivors retreated to the deep ocean sediments, to hydrothermal vents, to underground pockets where oxygen couldn't reach. These microbial exiles became the hidden custodians of Earth's oldest metabolisms, carrying on quietly in the planet's dark underbelly. Even today, their descendants live deep within the crust and in oxygen-deprived muds, continuing the same ancient chemical rituals they began billions of years ago. The anaerobes lost the world, but they didn't lose existence. While death spread across the shallow seas, the planet itself was also undergoing an extraordinary transformation. Oxygen didn't just kill life, it also reacted with the planet's very bones. Rocks rich in iron began to rust on a planetary scale, forming massive deposits of iron oxide. These deposits became the banded iron formations we find in ancient rock today, stripes of red and gray that mark the moment Earth's chemistry flipped. It was as if the entire planet had blushed from embarrassment over the chaos it caused. The newly oxygenated air also began to strip away the thick methane haze that had once wrapped the world in a warm, orange glow. Methane, a potent greenhouse gas, was being broken down by oxygen into carbon dioxide and water vapor. The result? A dramatic drop in global temperatures. The atmosphere that had once kept Earth cozy began to lose its insulating power, plunging the planet into one of its first major ice ages. Glaciers crept across the continents, freezing vast regions that had once been steamy swamps. Oceans cooled, currents shifted, and ecosystems that hadn't already suffocated now faced the bitter chill of a frozen planet. This period of deep freeze is sometimes called the Paleo-Proterozoic Snowball Earth. It's a haunting image. Oxygen, the bringer of fire, indirectly plunging the world into ice. Yet, as brutal as this oxygen catastrophe was, it also laid the foundation for something new. The survivors, forced into extreme environments, evolved clever biochemical defenses. Some microbes developed enzymes that could neutralize oxygen's destructive tendencies, early versions of antioxidants. Others found ways to use oxygen's reactivity to their advantage, harnessing it for more efficient energy production. These tiny innovations were the first sparks of aerobic life, organisms that didn't just tolerate oxygen but thrived on it. Meanwhile, the cyanobacteria that caused all this chaos continued multiplying, utterly oblivious to the destruction they'd unleashed. They didn't know they were terraforming a planet. They were just busy photosynthesizing, turning carbon dioxide into sugar and burping oxygen into the sky. In their wake, they created the first truly breathable atmosphere, one that billions of years later would become the perfect environment for animals like us. It's strange to imagine that the oxygen in your lungs was once a killer, that the same molecule keeping you alive today once sterilized the oceans and drove entire species underground. But that's evolution in a nutshell. What's lethal in one age becomes essential in the next. Life doesn't fear catastrophe. It repurposes it. The great oxygen catastrophe wasn't the end of life. It was the planet's first reboot. The biosphere crashed, reloaded, and came back stronger. The anaerobes had written the opening chapters of Earth's story. But now, a new cast of characters was about to take the stage. Organisms that could breathe fire from the air itself. The planet, once shrouded in haze, now shimmered under clearer skies. The seas were colder, the land was barren, but the world was breathing for the first time. In the grand paradox of existence, destruction had become creation. The poison had become the cure. And the earth, scarred but alive, was ready for its next experiment. Life that would not only survive oxygen, but come to depend on it entirely. When oxygen conquered the surface world and the oceans turned poisonous to the old order, the story of life didn't stop. It just changed its address. The surface may have become a death trap for the anaerobes, but beneath the crust, far from the reach of sunlight and oxygen, life quietly went underground. It was not extinction. It was migration. The world's first refugees didn't flee across land or sea. They sank into the dark. Beneath layers of sediment, inside porous rocks, and deep within the Earth's crust, microbial survivors found sanctuary. There, they discovered a world unlike any other. Pitch black, pressurized, and nearly timeless. The energy was scarce. The temperatures swung wildly, and nutrients arrived only through slow chemical diffusion. Yet somehow, in this hostile underworld, life endured. These hidden microbes became the planet's silent tenants, making homes in cracks so narrow you could fit hundreds across a single grain of sand. To them, rock wasn't a barrier. It was real estate. Minerals provided the scaffolding, while tiny traces of hydrogen, methane, and sulfur seeped through groundwater like whispers of fuel. They learned to live slowly, almost geologically. While surface life reproduced in hours, these underground dwellers might divide only once every few thousand years. In a way, they traded speed for eternity. Some lived in the deep marine sediments, buried miles beneath the ocean floor. There, far below the waves, the weight of water compressed the seafloor into dense layers of mud and clay. Oxygen could not penetrate these depths, but chemical reactions between the rock and seawater created small pockets of energy. Microbes tapped into those reactions, oxidizing hydrogen or reducing carbon compounds to squeeze out every drop of life's currency. Others ventured even deeper, into the planet's crust itself. These microbes, often called endoliths, didn't just live on rock surfaces, they lived inside them. They burrowed into microscopic pores, forming colonies that fed on trace minerals and radiogenic hydrogen, a byproduct of natural radioactivity in the rocks. Yes, you read that right. These creatures survived on energy born from atomic decay. Life had discovered nuclear cuisine long before humans thought to split an atom. Then there were the cave dwellers, microbial hermits living in caverns where no sunlight had ever shone. In these hollow worlds, they built entire ecosystems from scratch. Some fed on chemical drips that seeped through limestone, extracting energy from sulfur and iron compounds. Others formed delicate biofilms on cave walls, glistening like pale microbial constellations. Where humans might see desolation, these organisms saw opportunity. Every mineral surface, every damp crevice was a buffet if you had the right enzymes. This underground realm was the great equalizer of life. It didn't care about photosynthesis or oxygen. It was ruled instead by chemistry, patience, and endurance. The microbes here became masters of efficiency. Some entered dormant states for centuries, reawakening when conditions shifted. Others built protective shells around themselves, surviving heat, cold, and crushing pressure. They existed in a slow-motion world, a life not measured in seconds but in eons. What's remarkable is that this deep biosphere didn't just survive, it thrived. Studies of modern Earth show that the biomass beneath our feet, all the microbes living underground, may actually outweigh all plants and animals combined. Imagine that. More life exists in the dark beneath the surface than in all the forests, oceans, and skies we can see. The real biosphere isn't just on the surface. It's woven through the planet's bones. This subterranean world also served as an evolutionary vault. While the oxygen revolution was rewriting the rules for surface life, the underground preserved the old ways. Metabolisms that relied on sulfur, methane, or iron continued undisturbed. Genetic lineages that would have vanished on the surface quietly persisted below. Life's memory was stored in rock, a living archive of ancient biochemistry. It's not hard to see why this matters. When future catastrophes struck, global freezes, meteor impacts, or volcanic winters, these underground refuges became the ultimate survival shelters. While surface life suffered extinction after extinction, the underground biosphere barely noticed. Down there, the temperature stayed steady, shielded from radiation and cosmic chaos. It was life's insurance policy, its emergency bunker. Some scientists believe that if all surface life were wiped out tomorrow, the deep microbes would keep ticking, perhaps barely aware anything had changed. To them, time doesn't flow like it does for us. Their metabolisms are so slow that geological and biological timescales blur together. A single microbial lineage could outlive mountains, continents, even oceans. Life down there doesn't burn bright. It glows faintly forever. And if that idea feels alien, it should, because it's also a clue to life beyond Earth. The discovery of these shadow ecosystems has reshaped how we search for life on other worlds. Mars may look barren on the surface, but deep below it could harbor the same kind of microbial persistence. Europa and Enceladus, moons of Jupiter and Saturn, have oceans sealed beneath ice, warmed by their planet's gravity. If life exists there, it probably looks a lot like Earth's underground survivors, small, slow, and endlessly patient. Back on Earth, these microbes didn't just mark the past, they influenced the future. By continuing their ancient chemistries, they helped regulate the planet's carbon and sulfur cycles. Their steady, quiet activity released gases into the oceans and atmosphere that would later nourish surface ecosystems. Even hidden in darkness, they were still part of the planet's pulse. Unseen lungs exhaling balance into the world above. There's a poetic irony in it. The oldest life on Earth found safety not in the open, but in the hidden. When the surface became unlivable, life didn't give up. It simply went deeper, trading sunlight for stone, speed for survival. To this day, every breath of air, every drop of water, passes through molecules once shaped by those ancient underground communities. Theirs is the legacy of persistence, the proof that life doesn't need light to find meaning. In the quiet beneath our feet, life continues as it always has, unseen, unhurried, and unstoppable. For billions of years, Earth was a microbial monopoly. Single-celled organisms ruled every corner of the planet, from the boiling vents to the frozen shallows. They had perfected simplicity, tiny bags of chemistry capable of surviving almost anything. But then, something extraordinary began to unfold. Life decided to get complicated, not because it needed to, but because it could. And the consequences would change the course of evolution forever. This shift didn't happen overnight. Complexity is expensive. It requires energy, coordination, and patience. 3 things microbes don't usually waste. For most of life's history, survival meant staying small and efficient. But in a world suddenly rich in oxygen, energy was no longer scarce. The old chemical engines that powered anaerobes were outclassed by new aerobic metabolisms that extracted up to 20 times more energy from the same amount of food. It was like switching from a crank-powered bicycle to a jet engine. With that newfound abundance, evolution could afford to dream bigger. The key to this transformation came from one of the most remarkable partnerships in Earth's history, a merger so successful that it's still running your body right now. Somewhere around 2 billion years ago, one single-celled organism engulfed another. It wasn't an act of friendship at first. More likely, it was a clumsy attempt at lunch. But instead of digesting its prey, the host cell kept it alive. The swallowed microbe, possibly an ancient bacterium, turned out to be really good at one thing, producing energy through oxygen respiration. And rather than fighting, the two struck a deal. Protection in exchange for power. That partnership gave rise to the eukaryotic cell, the ancestor of all plants, animals, fungi, and complex life on Earth. Inside each of these new cells, the former guest evolved into an organelle we now call the mitochondrion. You have about 10 quadrillion of them right now, quietly humming inside your cells, turning food into usable energy. They're like miniature power plants, still carrying traces of their bacterial ancestry. In fact, mitochondria even have their own DNA, a genetic relic from a time when they were independent beings. But this merger didn't just create a better battery, it created an entirely new way to organize life. The eukaryotic cell became a biological city, full of internal compartments, each specializing in a different job. Some handled energy, others stored nutrients, and others processed genetic information. For the first time, cells could multitask efficiently. They could grow larger, store more genes, and evolve new structures. Life had unlocked the power of division of labor. Soon, these new cells began forming other partnerships. Some engulfed photosynthetic bacteria, giving rise to chloroplasts, the sunlight harvesting factories inside plants and algae. Just like mitochondria, chloroplasts were once free-living organisms that became permanent residents. Evolution had discovered the benefits of outsourcing. Why build a system from scratch when you can hire a bacterium that already knows how to do the job? The rise of eukaryotes was more than just a biological upgrade. It was a social revolution. Cells began communicating internally, coordinating chemical signals, and regulating when genes turned on or off. This complexity allowed them to adapt faster and more creatively than ever before. They started to experiment with shapes, appendages, and behaviors. Some evolved whip-like tails called flagella to move through water. Others grew rigid outer skeletons for protection. The microbial world, once dominated by simple blobs, began to bloom with diversity. And while this might sound like a straightforward upward march toward complexity, it wasn't. It was trial and error on a planetary scale. Many early experiments failed spectacularly. Mergers that didn't stick, organelles that went rogue, lineages that grew too complex to sustain themselves. But evolution doesn't mind failure. It learns from it. The few successful partnerships became the foundation for everything that followed. Over time, these new complex cells began forming colonies, loose associations of individuals that shared resources. It was the first glimmer of multicellularity, though it started out modestly. Groups of cells that stayed together had a survival advantage. They could share nutrients, resist predators, and divide tasks among members. Some cells specialized in reproduction, while others focused on protection or feeding. This was biology's first workforce. Primitive but effective. The jump from single cell to multicellular organism didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It was a gradual weaving of cooperation into DNA itself. Communication networks evolved. Chemical messages that told cells when to divide, when to specialize, and when to sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony. The first true multicellular creatures were probably microscopic filaments or blobs of sticky cells clinging together for mutual benefit. But inside those clusters was the seed of every future plant, animal, and fungus. It's humbling to realize how much of modern life is built on ancient teamwork. Your cells, for example, are living museums of this history, each one a collection of once separate organisms working in perfect harmony. Your mitochondria still carry remnants of their bacterial genes, and they divide inside your cells the same way bacteria divide in the wild. You are, quite literally, a walking merger. The birth of complex cells also transformed Earth itself. With eukaryotes came new kinds of biological recycling, faster nutrient turnover, and the beginnings of ecological complexity. Food webs began to form. Predation, competition, and cooperation became driving forces of evolution. For the first time, life wasn't just reacting to the environment, it was shaping it. And yet, in a cosmic sense, it all began with one lucky mistake. A cell tried to eat another, failed, and accidentally invented complexity. It's hard to imagine a more productive failure in the history of the universe. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by emails, take comfort in knowing that your mitochondria, those tiny bacterial roommates from 2 billion years ago, have been managing energy crises far longer than you have. They, along with the countless partnerships that followed, remind us that life's greatest leaps often come not from competition, but from collaboration. The slow birth of complexity was less an explosion than a quiet handshake, one that would echo through every living thing that ever came after. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that your entire planet has turned into a popsicle. Not just the poles, not just the mountains, everything. Oceans locked beneath miles of ice, continents entombed in frost, sunlight bouncing off a frozen mirror that stretched from equator to equator. That was Earth roughly 700 million years ago, during what scientists now call Snowball Earth. It wasn't just a bad winter, it was the most extreme climate crisis our planet has ever known. This glacial apocalypse didn't arrive overnight, it crept in slowly, triggered by a delicate chain of feedbacks that spiraled out of control. For millions of years before the freeze, life had been busy changing the planet's chemistry. Photosynthetic microbes and algae had been sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, locking it into rock and organic matter. Volcanic activity, which normally replenished atmospheric gases, couldn't keep up. As carbon dioxide levels dropped, the planet's greenhouse blanket thinned, and the temperature began to plummet. Once the cooling started, ice began to form at the poles. Ice, being shiny and reflective, bounced more sunlight back into space. That made the planet even colder, which grew more ice, which reflected more sunlight, a runaway loop that ended in a complete global freeze. The oceans, once home to thriving microbial communities, sealed over with thick layers of ice, possibly hundreds of meters deep. Even the equator, that traditional symbol of warmth and sunshine, was buried in frost. If you were looking down from space, Earth would have looked eerily pale, a bright white sphere gleaming against the blackness of space like a snow globe no one dared shake. It's hard to believe such a sight could be real, but geological evidence tells the story clearly. Layers of glacial deposits have been found on every continent, even near the equator. Rocks formed from frozen sediments carry traces of this ancient ice age, a planetary scar written in stone. For life, this was the ultimate stress test. Surface waters froze, oxygen levels dropped, and sunlight, the main energy source for photosynthetic organisms, was cut off. The global refrigerator had been turned on full blast, and there was no off switch in sight. Many species likely vanished completely. But, as always, life found a loophole. Beneath the ice, in the deepest parts of the oceans, hydrothermal vents continued to belch out heat and minerals from the planet's molten heart. Around those vents, microbial communities survived, just as their ancestors had billions of years earlier. These vent dwellers became the custodians of life, holding on in the darkness while the rest of the world froze above them. Chemosynthesis, using chemical reactions instead of sunlight to create food, once again proved its worth. Other life forms might have clung to existence in thin ribbons of liquid water trapped beneath the ice sheets or around volcanic islands that poked through the frozen surface. Even in catastrophe, Earth was patchy. There were cracks, refuges, and pockets of hope. Life didn't need much, just a drop of water, a spark of energy, and time. Inside those dark refuges, evolution slowed to a crawl but didn't stop. Some organisms likely adapted to the cold, developing anti-freeze-like proteins to prevent their internal fluids from crystallizing. Others formed cysts, hardened, dormant states that allowed them to wait out the cold like biological time capsules. These survivors were evolution's marathon runners, enduring a race that lasted millions of years. Meanwhile, on the frozen surface, the planet's atmosphere was changing. Volcanic eruptions, though muffled by the ice, continued to release carbon dioxide. Without rain or vegetation to absorb it, the gas slowly built up in the atmosphere. Over millions of years, that invisible accumulation tipped the balance. Carbon dioxide trapped more and more heat until the frozen grip began to loosen. When the thaw finally came, it was sudden, violent, and transformative. Imagine the scene: glaciers melting on a planetary scale, torrents of water crashing down ancient valleys, and oceans swelling with the return of liquid life. The climate swung from deep freeze to sauna almost overnight in geological terms. The atmosphere, once choked with carbon dioxide, turned into a greenhouse again, cooking the planet in a massive rebound effect. It was as if Earth, realizing it had gone too far, slammed the thermostat the other way. The aftermath was equally dramatic. As the glaciers melted, they scoured continents clean, releasing minerals that flooded into the oceans. Those nutrients acted like fertilizer for the microbial survivors, sparking explosions of new life. Photosynthetic organisms, dormant for eons, roared back into action, pumping out oxygen and reawakening ecosystems. The deep freeze had been a purge. Brutal, yes, but it reset the environmental balance, clearing the slate for something new to emerge. In fact, many scientists believe that the snowball Earth events helped pave the way for the rise of complex multicellular life. The stress of near extinction may have driven evolution toward innovation. The survivors, toughened by the cold and forced to cooperate, were primed for change. When the ice retreated, the world was theirs to reinvent. The first large, soft-bodied organisms, the ancestors of animals, appear in the fossil record soon after. It's as if the planet needed to freeze solid before it could thaw into creativity. From a cosmic perspective, Snowball Earth was both catastrophe and opportunity. It demonstrated that life isn't fragile porcelain. It's rubber, capable of bending without breaking. The same planet that had once been a molten inferno now survived as a frozen marble, and through both extremes, life endured. It's almost poetic. The microbes that survived were the same kind that had once thrived in volcanic vents, back when Earth was still cooling from its birth. Billions of years later, they were still there, defying extinction again. The deep freeze was Earth's reboot, a cosmic Control-Alt-Delete, and those microscopic, stubborn files refused to be erased. When the world finally thawed, it wasn't the same planet anymore. The air was richer, the oceans deeper, and the survivors more resilient than ever. Out of the cold silence came diversity, innovation, and the first faint stirrings of complex life. The planet had tested itself to the brink of lifelessness, and found that life was far too tenacious to let go. When the last of the great ice sheets began to retreat, Earth didn't thaw quietly. It erupted into brightness. For millions of years, sunlight had been nothing more than a faint rumor beneath miles of frozen crust. The oceans had been dark, muted, and silent. But as the global glaciers melted away, sunlight pierced the atmosphere and struck open seas once again. It was like lifting a cosmic curtain. After a billion years of twilight, the stage lights finally came on, and life had an encore to perform. What followed wasn't just a change in climate, it was a full planetary awakening. The dark, nutrient-rich waters that had been sealed under ice were suddenly bathed in light, a combination as potent as caffeine for evolution. Dormant photosynthetic organisms, the microbial pioneers that once invented oxygen, came roaring back with a vengeance. With the ice gone and the sun blazing unobstructed, photosynthesis became the main energy engine of the biosphere. These newly freed oceans became biological factories. Microbes like cyanobacteria multiplied explosively, forming great green blooms across the water's surface. The planet that had once glimmered white from space now glowed blue and emerald. Earth had finally found its color palette. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise again, steadily reshaping the chemistry of air and sea alike. Each molecule of oxygen produced by photosynthesis was another chisel stroke carving the future of complex life. But this wasn't just a return to the old oxygen world. It was evolution's grand sequel, bigger, brighter, and more creative. The nutrients released from melting glaciers acted like fertilizer, flooding the oceans with phosphorus, iron, and other vital elements. This chemical feast gave photosynthetic organisms everything they needed to thrive, and soon food webs began to form in ways the planet had never seen. Predators appeared, not in the sense of jaws and teeth just yet, but single-celled hunters that chased, engulfed, and digested their neighbors. The age of passive survival was ending. In the sunlight, new shapes emerged. Some microbes grew filaments to stay closer to the light. Others developed pigments, not just for photosynthesis, but for protection. After all, sunlight can be generous with energy, but cruel with radiation. These pigments, absorbing and reflecting different wavelengths, gave early life its first tints of green, red, and brown. Color wasn't just beauty, it was armor. Evolution was painting an ultraviolet defense. Meanwhile, the atmosphere transformed. With oxygen on the rise again, the ozone layer thickened, creating a shield that filtered out the deadliest rays of the sun. For the first time, shallow waters and coastal environments became safe for sustained life. The oceans no longer had to hide under the protection of darkness. The sun, once a killer, had become an ally. This burst of light-driven productivity triggered what scientists would call the second oxygenation event. It was less of an explosion and more of a symphony, slow, powerful, and unstoppable. Oxygen accumulated in the seas and spilled into the skies, oxidizing minerals and changing the color of the continents themselves. Rust-red rocks began to form again, recording this new breath of the planet. Earth was not just alive, it was breathing rhythmically now, cycling gases and elements through vast ecological feedback loops. In this new sunlit world, the foundations for complexity deepened. Eukaryotic cells, those intricate, partnership-based powerhouses, found new energy in the abundance of light and oxygen. They diversified into countless forms, experimenting with soils, structure, and cooperation. Some became multicellular, building bodies cell by cell. Others turned into drifting colonies, precursors to the first true animals and plants. It was as if evolution had been sitting in the dark for billions of years, sketching blueprints by candlelight, and suddenly someone flipped the switch. The designs came alive. Energy was no longer the limiting factor. With sunlight powering photosynthesis and oxygen fueling metabolism, biology had both the fuel and the fire. Sunlight didn't just energize life, it gave it vision, quite literally. Over the next hundreds of millions of years, the ability to sense light evolved. Photosensitive proteins turned into primitive eye spots, helping organisms detect day and night, predators and prey. For the first time, life began to see. The planet wasn't just alive, it was becoming aware. The visual transformation of Earth was staggering. Algal mats tinted the shallow seas jade and turquoise. Microbial pigments painted shorelines with streaks of orange, violet, and green. The sky, once suffocated by methane haze, now gleamed a brilliant blue, reflected by the vast open ocean. From space, Earth had gone from a frozen pearl to a shimmering sapphire. The planet of ice had become the planet of light, and yet, not all life embraced the brightness. Deep below the waves, in caves and sediments, the shadow dwellers still thrived. Darkness, after all, had been the original cradle of life, and it wasn't giving up its tenants so easily. Even as sunlight claimed the surface, the dark biosphere persisted, quietly reminding evolution that life doesn't choose sides, it simply adapts. But up above, something irreversible had begun. The balance between light and life was now permanent. Photosynthesis had claimed dominance, and oxygen would forever shape the story of biology. The atmosphere was richer, the oceans more dynamic, and ecosystems more interconnected than ever before. Earth had effectively rebooted, not back to what it was, but forward into what it could become. The deep freeze had wiped the canvas clean, and sunlight painted something entirely new, an open-air world filled with potential. From this point on, evolution would never again operate in the shadows. Light had become the universe's favorite sculptor, carving complexity out of simplicity, color out of chemistry, and awareness out of adaptation. When the ice melted and the sun returned, life didn't just thaw, it blossomed. The darkness had built the foundation, but the light built the cathedral. And as evolution's eyes adjusted to the brilliance, it began to see not only the world but itself reflected in every glimmering wave. For all the brilliance that sunlight brought to earth, the story of darkness never ended. It simply moved underground, undersea, and under everything. While forests flourished in daylight and coral reefs basked in shimmering shallows, the old, unlit world continued beneath, unchanged and undeterred. It's easy to forget that half of our planet's biosphere, and maybe more, still lives without a single photon of sunlight. The legacy of that ancient darkness is not gone. It's alive, glowing, creeping, and whispering reminders that life was born in the shadows. Let's start at the ocean's bottom, where sunlight has never reached. Beyond the last glimmers of blue, in depths so black that even light gives up trying, entire kingdoms exist. Down there, the pressure is immense, enough to crush a human submarine like a tin can, and the temperature hovers near freezing. Yet this abyssal world isn't empty. It's alive with creatures so strange they might as well be aliens. Take the anglerfish, for instance, that deep-sea celebrity with a lantern on its forehead. It's not holding a flashlight, it's carrying bacteria that emit light through chemical reactions. This partnership, called bioluminescence, is a survival strategy inherited from ancient microbial chemistry. The same principle that once allowed early life to use chemical energy in the dark. In the abyss, where eyes are rare and shadows are endless, light becomes language. Some creatures use it to lure prey, others to signal mates, and some just to look like something too weird to eat. And it's not just fish. There are jellyfish that pulse with ghostly blue halos, squid that communicate through Morse code-like flashes, and shrimp that vomit glowing clouds as a defense mechanism. Underwater fireworks from the world's oldest party. Every flicker in that black ocean is a reminder of life's ingenuity in the absence of the sun. Yet even deeper, far below where anything can swim, life persists inside the very crust of the earth. Bacteria and archaea live in microscopic fractures within rocks, sustained by chemical reactions between minerals and water. These subterranean microbes, some living miles beneath the surface, extract energy from iron, sulfur, and hydrogen. It's slow, patient chemistry. Life measured in molecules and millennia. Some of these organisms divide so rarely that a single generation might last centuries. They are, in a sense, the planet's heartbeat slowed to a whisper. Caves tell another chapter of the dark story. Inside their winding tunnels, cut off from sunlight for millions of years, life has evolved into eerie elegance. There are cave fish that have lost their eyes completely. Why waste energy on vision when the world is pitch black? Their skin turned pale, their bodies elongated to sense vibrations and water currents. They don't see the world. They feel it. Then there are blind salamanders, pale crustaceans, and microbes that feast on mineral deposits dripping from the ceiling. Every organism in this world has adapted to a silence so deep it's almost physical. where the only rhythm is the slow drip of water and the faint hiss of air. Even the soil beneath our feet teems with unseen activity. Billions of bacteria toil in microscopic darkness, breaking down organic matter, recycling nutrients, and powering the ecosystems above. They are the quiet laborers of life, descendants of the same chemical eaters that once dominated the early earth. Without them, forests would starve, oceans would choke, and life as we know it would grind to a halt. Darkness, it seems, is not a void. It's an engine running beneath everything bright. And then there's bioluminescence, the poetry of light born from darkness. Across the planet, from glowing plankton to fireflies, organisms have evolved to make their own light. It's as if evolution couldn't resist giving darkness its own sparkle. The genes responsible for bioluminescence are ancient, passed down and repurposed over eons. What started as simple chemical reactions to manage oxygen or deter predators became one of nature's most beautiful spectacles. Beaches that shimmer at night with glowing waves, fungi that turn forest floors into green constellations. These are the fingerprints of the ancient dark world, still shining through. Scientists estimate that more than half of all microbial species on Earth live below the surface, untouched by sunlight. The deep biosphere, stretching kilometers underground, may contain more carbon than all the plants and animals on the surface combined. It's like discovering that the planet's true ecosystem isn't what we see. It's what we don't. These invisible empires of bacteria and archaea are still running the same ancient chemistries that kept Earth alive before oxygen, before photosynthesis, before even the concept of day. And perhaps the most humbling thought is this: if life can flourish so richly in eternal night here, it might do the same elsewhere. The frozen moons of Jupiter and Saturn, Europa and Enceladus, hide oceans beneath their icy shells, warmed by internal heat. If anything lives there, it probably looks more like the microbes of Earth's deep crust than the creatures of its sunny seas. Our planet's darkness may not just be a relic of the past. It may be the blueprint for life in the universe. The legacy of darkness is resilience. It's a reminder that life doesn't need the warmth of a star or the comfort of color to thrive. It can build entire civilizations in the cold and the quiet, feeding on rock and patience. The same chemistry that gave rise to the first cells still hums unseen in the Earth's depths, as steady and ancient as time itself. So, when we look at the sparkling oceans or bright green forests, it's easy to think that light defines life, but beneath every ray of sunshine lies a deeper truth, that the dark never left. It's still here, alive and thriving, a reminder of where we came from. And, in a poetic twist, the creatures of darkness, the glowworms, the vent dwellers, the blind fish, the radiant jelly, bring their own light into the void. They prove that life doesn't just adapt to darkness, it redefines it. In every flicker, every shimmer, every ghostly glow, the ancient world whispers back, "I never went away." If you trace your ancestry back far enough, and not just through your family tree, but through time itself, you end up in the dark, not metaphorically, but literally. Before eyes could see, before sunlight touched the first leaf, before oxygen filled the air, The ancestors of every living thing existed in a world of blackness. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought you've ever had is powered by the descendants of those first shadow dwellers. Life didn't start illuminated. It began as chemistry feeling its way through the dark. And somehow, over billions of years, that chemistry learned how to think. The story of consciousness, of awareness, curiosity, and imagination doesn't begin with brains or nerves. It begins with cooperation, with cells learning to communicate and sense their surroundings. Those ancient microbes that lived without light had to respond to temperature, pressure, and chemical gradients. They couldn't see, but they could sense. That sensitivity, that ability to react to the environment, was the first faint spark of awareness. It wasn't thought yet, but it was the root of it. Information becoming action. Fast forward billions of years, and those ancient sensory systems still exist in us. The mitochondria that power your brain, for instance, are the direct descendants of bacteria that once lived independently in the ancient oceans. They carry their own DNA, separate from yours, a biological signature older than multicellularity itself. When your neurons fire, when ideas flicker across your mind, they're burning the same chemical fuel those early microbes once used to survive beside volcanic vents. The mind is just chemistry that learned to dream. In a poetic twist, the very cells that evolved in darkness are the reason we can perceive light. The first eyes were nothing more than clusters of light-sensitive proteins, primitive detectors that helped organisms sense day from night, danger from safety. Over time, these detectors became more complex, turning darkness into contrast, contrast into form, and form into vision. And eventually, some of those organisms looked up and realized they were not just in the world, they were aware of it. The leap from sensing to knowing was the universe's most profound awakening. But even as we stepped into the light, the darkness remained written into our biology. Humans are creatures of both day and night. Our circadian rhythms, the internal clocks that tell us when to sleep and wake, are built on the same cycles that guided life in the primordial dark. Deep in our brains, the pineal gland still responds to the absence of light, releasing melatonin as if whispering, "The dark is here. Rest now." Every night, as you drift into sleep, your body re-enters the rhythm of the ancient world, surrendering to a darkness older than stars. It's easy to think of darkness as an emptiness, as absence. But for most of life's history, it was the opposite. It was presence. Darkness was the world's first home, the steady background against which everything else unfolded. When early life began, the planet's surface was lit only by magma, lightning, and the faint glow of starlight. The creatures that thrived there didn't fear the dark. They were the dark, part of a cosmos still half asleep. That legacy lives on not just in our cells, but in our instincts and imagination. We gaze at the night sky and feel something ancient stir, wonder, curiosity, the pull of the unknown, and that feeling isn't new. It's the echo of our oldest memory, the one encoded before we had memory at all. We are drawn to the dark because we came from it. The same black void that once nurtured microbial life now stretches above us as a canvas for thought. And perhaps that's what consciousness really is, the universe's way of seeing its own shadow. The atoms that make up your brain were forged in the hearts of stars, then wandered through cosmic night for billions of years before finding each other again here, in you. Every neuron, every spark of thought is the light of that ancient night turned inward. When you think, you're continuing a process that began when molecules first learned to interact. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that your ability to wonder where you came from is where you came from. Life didn't just crawl out of the dark, it carried the dark with it. It used it, shaped it, and built meaning on top of it. Our ancestors didn't escape the night. They learned to shine within it. Even our myths, our stories of creation, carry this truth. Nearly every culture begins with darkness, a void, a sea, a womb, and then light emerging from it. Science, in its own poetic way, tells the same story. The consciousness reading these words, the one pondering how it all began, is built from that same lineage. Your thoughts are powered by ancient bacteria. Your senses evolved from cells that once lived in eternal black. Every moment of awareness is a tiny rebellion against that darkness, and also a tribute to it, because without it, there would be nothing to illuminate. So when you look up at the night sky, at the infinite dark between the stars, remember that you're not separate from it. You're made of it. You're the descendant of creatures that thrived in the absence of light, the inheritor of their resilience and curiosity. The darkness doesn't just surround you, it made you. Life didn't begin in the light. It began in the quiet chemistry of shadow, learning slowly, stubbornly, how to endure. And when it finally found the light, it didn't forget its origins. It carried that darkness forward, transformed, not erased, and used it to think, to dream, to become self-aware. Consciousness is the ultimate glow in the void, the universe remembering itself through us. We are living proof that the dark was never the enemy of life. It was its teacher. It taught matter how to organize, how to persist, and, eventually, how to wonder where it came from. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of all, that from the black silence of a world without light came beings who could look into that silence and see not emptiness, but meaning. We didn't escape the darkness. We became its voice.